Medicine Innovation Symposium, or as we like to call it, STEMIX. I'm here alongside my co-host, co-director, Daniel Imler. I realize we just had some technical difficulties. I will say it is my fault. I was trying to get fancy and be innovative with a USB microphone, and I've just had to disconnect that, and now we're going with the standard MacBook microphone. So good morning. Sorry about that. A few hiccups here, but I think that's okay. We're still going to be on time. Dan, we've got a lot coming up today. I'm really excited about the program. Can you give us a little preview?
Sure. This is why we bake in those extra 5-10 minutes at the beginning here. So we'll now that Jason and I have done our dry run with no sound, we can do it with sound. We're super excited to have everybody here today. Today we're going to go through a keynote speak from Dr. Bruce Leff, which we're super excited about. That's going to start here in about 5 minutes as soon as we're done with this introduction. We then have 4 different keynotes with amazing speakers on 4 different really great topics in innovation and emergency medicine. And then we also have a pitch competition for the first time this year, which is 6 different companies that are going to come that are within the emergency medicine space and talk about what they're thinking about in terms of where the future of emergency medicine is going to go. So I don't want to belabor anything else. I do want to thank just a few people before we get started. Ezra Kristen and Sue Copa, as well as Matt Strela, who have been instrumental at Stanford for continuing to help us get this conference live. We're super excited about coming to you for our 2nd year. Every year, we're going to make this bigger, better, and we're super excited to get started now.
Cool. And we're going to help you guide through the process today. Every time we move to a different topic, we're going to be moving to a different room. So each of the roundtables will have a different spot on your agenda, which you'll click on to join. Okay? Yeah. And we're going to remind you of that as we move through the day.
Yeah. So you're in the right place right now. We're going to start our keynote in this room right now. But as soon as we end this, they'll be in the next the next roundtable will be the next thing on your agenda in the Run the World app. Okay. With that being said, maybe we can get Andra and Dr. Leff up here on stage. Dr. Leff, can you turn on your mic and your camera? Great. And then can you bring... Okay.
And we'll have Dr. Blomkons just accept your invite to the stage. And
there we go. Perfect.
Good morning, everyone. We'll see you after this keynote. Yep.
All righty. Good morning, everyone. Hello, my name is Andra Blomkons. I'm chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine at Stanford Emergency Medicine here. Welcome to our 2nd annual STEMIX. I have the honor and privilege of being able to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Bruce Leff. Thank you very much for joining us here today. We always consider that it's not just enough here to practice emergency medicine, but it's also our obligation on how to improve medicine for those in the future. So Dr. Leff is a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where he directs the Center for Transformative Geriatric Research. His research involves focusing on the novel models of healthcare for older adults, with an emphasis on home and community-based models of care, including hospital at home, home-based primary care, capable, and other such models. He leads the National Home-Based Primary Care and Palliative Care Learning Collaborative. He's served on multiple quality forums, including NCQA, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, that's CMS, and many other expert panels. He's authored more than 125 articles, 35 book chapters, and 2 textbooks. He continues to serve and has served a number of leadership positions on the American Board of Internal Medicine, and also serves on the editorial board of the Annals of Internal Medicine. Dr. Leff, thank you so much for joining us here today, and we're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thanks, Andrew. It's delightful to be here. Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Dan. Let me share my screen, and we'll see how that all works. Okay. So are you seeing a slide, a single slide, or a bunch, or 2 slides, just to make sure?
We are seeing the presenter view right now.
The presenter. So let me get rid of that. Let's try that again. Let's stop sharing. How's that? And let's do that.
That's perfect.
Great. All right, we're all set up with the video, and let's get started. So again, delighted to be here. Would have been nicer to have been in person, but we'll have to settle for this. I'm going to be talking today about transforming care delivery with a model called hospital at home. And I'm going to start off with the thesis, and that is that I think hospital at home care will be mainstreamed into the U.S. healthcare delivery system. I think a whole bunch of home and community-based models are going to be mainstreamed and will have an effect on hospital care, will have an effect on emergency medicine as well. So I'm a geriatrician and internal medicine doc. I see patients in the hospital, I see patients at home, I see patients in clinic. And my interest in this space started when I was a general medicine resident at Hopkins. And as a second-year resident, we picked up an extra longitudinal clinic, and mine was in our home-based primary care program. And I think you have one of those programs at Stanford, which is run through your geriatrics division. And this was a model of care focused on older adults who were basically homebound. They were unable to access our office-based ambulatory practice. And our geriatrics division would send internal medicine residents, geriatric fellows, geriatrics faculty to their home to provide ongoing longitudinal care in the home. And for me, that was a transformative experience. I really, really love that. I felt it really made me a much better doctor. I got to see patients living in their social determinants of health, and got to see them and their caregivers. And I think it made me better at communicating with them, certainly better at physical exams, since a lot of the technology was not right in the room next door. I think I got better at developing reasonable diagnostic plans, better at educating my patients, and it really sparked a strong interest in me. So I started to go into the literature to try and figure out, what is home care and what is home-based care and home-based medical care. And the literature was really quite confusing, partly because there are only so many words in the English language to refer to home and care and services and the like. So early in my journey, I created this, what I would call now a fairly primitive mental map of home-based care services. And so over on the left, you have informal services. Those are services that are provided usually by family or friends, often by daughters-in-law, and wives. Women are doing much more of this than men in general. These are usually services that friends and family provide for free. So if I'm an older person and I have a dementia and I need someone to help give me a bath, hopefully my spouse will do that for me. And this provides billions of dollars basically in free labor in our healthcare delivery system. If I don't have someone to provide that service for me at home, a friend or family member, I can actually purchase those services. And those are called formal personal care services. Usually the standard model is you have to purchase several hours of that service at a time, usually at least four hours or so. Usually you're being charged anywhere from $25 to $50 per hour, rarely covered by insurance unless you have some special kind of long-term care insurance plan. It is covered under Medicaid in many states. And that's about 2 million people getting that kind of service each year. A service you may be more familiar with is skilled home healthcare. That is the Medicare skilled home healthcare benefit. So remember, that's a Medicare Part A benefit, the same category of Medicare benefit that applies to hospital care. And that's provided by Medicare to folks who have what Medicare calls a skilled need. So the spouse who gives a bath to his or her partner, that's not a skilled need. In Medicare's point of view, anyone can give someone a bath, but it takes a nurse or an occupational therapist or a physical therapist to provide what's called skilled care. So if someone meets Medicare definition for being homebound and has a skilled need for nurse, OT, or PT, Medicare will provide home-based services of those skilled providers, usually in 30-day blocks of time. And the payment is calculated on an incredibly complicated algorithm based on conditions and services needed and degree of functional impairment. And in any given year, about 3.5 million older adults will receive that service. Moving over a little bit to the right, you have home-based primary care, the service I just described, what I was doing during my residency and beyond. So giving longitudinal medical care in the home for folks who are too frail to get into the clinic. Probably about 500,000 or so receive that kind of service each year. And then over on the right, we have hospital at home, which is hospital level care provided in the home as a substitute for care provided in the hospital. And we'll talk about that in some depth. So as you move from left to right on this slide, you go from a low acuity towards a higher medical acuity kind of construct. You go from a chronic care frame of mind more towards acute, longitudinal and acute care. And you go from models that have little or no physician or advanced practice provider involvement to models that have much more of that involvement. So this was the sort of the primitive mental map. But I would say this field is expanding and getting disrupted. And I think disruption here in mostly a positive way. So on that primitive map, I superimposed a whole bunch of things that have been happening over the last 5 to 10 years. So you've seen, starting in the top left, the emergence of home-based palliative care models. So usually not longitudinal, usually a bit more episodic for folks who are at home and need specialized palliative care. We've seen the emergence, moving to the right, of transitional and post-acute care services over the last 20 years, in theory to help reduce the risk of hospital readmissions, which are so prevalent. You can now get urgent care at home and on your phone with apps to get a doc or advanced practice provider on the phone in a video, or order someone like an Uber to come to your home and help take care of you. We've seen the emergence, moving again to the right, to EMS, emergency medical services, and mobile integrated health paramedicine-based models. These models vary a bit by state and state-related regulation, but the ability to get someone with great assessment skills and the ability often to do treatment on the spot as a substitute for sending someone to the emergency room. Moving down to the bottom left, I have a box there for formal personal care services plus. So the idea of, instead of having to arrange for someone to give me a bath and buy the service in 4-hour blocks of time and work through a personal care agency or a home health agency, again, sort of the Uberization of this going on my phone. And in certain cities, and San Francisco being one of them, you can go on your phone and say, I'd like a Mandarin-speaking woman to come to my home tomorrow at 1 p.m. for 1 hour to give me a bath. Those kinds of services are becoming more available. Function-focused brief intervention, so the capable model developed by my colleague Sarah Zanton in the School of Nursing here at Hopkins. So a time-limited intervention of a nurse, occupational therapist, and a handyman, targeted initially at dually eligible Medicare and Medicaid eligible older adults who had deficiencies in their activities of daily living. Time-limited intervention focuses on patient goals, actually improves ADL function, activity of daily living function, which is rare in these types of interventions, and reduces Medicare and Medicaid spending with a 10-to-1 ROI in year one. Seen the emergence of home-based primary care co-management models, and some of these got started in California. So models like Landmark and others like MedZed. So putting docs and nurse practitioners out into the home, usually under risk arrangements with Medicare Advantage plans or other kinds of capitated payment models, and help office-based primary care doctors manage their most complex patients. Moving down towards the bottom left, you've seen an explosion in the telemedicine and remote sensor space, and also you've seen the emergence of rehabilitation home models as substitute for skilled nursing facilities. So a lot is happening in this space. This is not even a complete list of all the disruptors, but it's a very, very active space. So moving back to and starting to talk now about hospital at home and why we need hospital at home. So this is a gentleman named Walter. He's someone I took care of years ago in our home-based primary care program. He was an older gentleman, aging in place, had multiple chronic conditions, including heart failure and COPD. And you can see in this picture, he's wearing his nasal cannula. His cat is on his lap. And, we tried to do our level best to take care of him in the home, but his chronic conditions would often exacerbate, and he would need to be admitted to the hospital, often for COPD or heart failure. And these were Walter's observations about his care in the hospital. He would say things like, I can't get my breathing treatments on time, so I end up on a ventilator. He said the food stinks. Actually, he was a bit more graphic about that, but wanted to keep it clean for all my friends here on the West Coast. No one would talk to him in the hospital, so it was a bit of a lonely experience. He says, I got confused and tied down, so he developed incident delirium and was physically restrained. And he never forgot that. He talked about that for the rest of his life, one of the most humiliating experiences in his life. He says, and I know this happens only in Baltimore, he said, I always come home with a completely new set of medicines. And then, one day Walter got sick. We were out making a house call. He clearly had a community-acquired pneumonia. His oxygen level was a bit borderline, sitting in the high 80s, low 90s on oxygen. And, we said, Walter, you're sick. You got to go to the hospital. And he said, listen, I am so sick and tired. Really, I'm so sick and tired of you geniuses from Hopkins. You're great doctors. You run a crappy hotel. I'm not going to the hospital. This is on you. This is your problem. And it was for instances like this, which were not uncommon, because older people, when they go to the hospital, often experience iatrogenic complications. Over time, this has become recognized as its own syndrome, the hospital-associated disability syndrome. And we started to think, what could we do differently? Could we do hospital-level care at home? So we started to think about developing version 1.0 of hospital at home. And this work started in the early mid-1990s. So here's a basic outline of model version 1.0. Someone comes to the hospital, very, very commonly, in most cases, it's the emergency department, and they are assessed by an emergency medicine physician to require a hospital admission. They have to meet certain medical criteria to be considered for hospital at home, but they do have to meet the threshold for admission. Patient agrees to treatment at home. They're taken home, sometimes in an ambulance, sometimes in another form of medical transport. And then in our early version, they would get the care at home that they would have gotten in the hospital. So they would get nursing and physician visits in the home. They would get intravenous medicines and fluids in the home. They could get blood tests and echocardiograms and x-rays in the home. And then we would take care of them for a few days. They would get better and they would be discharged. This is really before any focus, if you're old enough to remember the early mid-90s, before the focus on post-acute care and readmissions, and a decade and a half before the Affordable Care Act. So this was the early model. In this slide, this is basically a 25, 30-year summary of work in one slide, and I just wanted to give you the overview relatively quickly. So going back to the mid-90s, 1994 or so, we started to think about the construct of hospital at home and said, who are we going to take care of? How are we going to select those patients? So we did a lot of work using claims data and chart review data and, crowdsourcing clinical wisdom, and developed medical eligibility criteria for hospital at home, determining who and what to treat. And we started with 4 basic conditions: pneumonia, heart failure, COPD exacerbations, and cellulitis. We did some early studies on acceptability of the model. If we built this thing, would people want to get care in it? And even going back to the late 90s, it seemed that people were hesitant many times to get care in the hospital and were looking for an alternative. We did an early clinical pilot study at Hopkins. It took about a year to get it through our IRB at Hopkins, but we did about 20 patients at home. And they did well. Their heads did not explode. They had good clinical outcomes. They had excellent care experience, and the cost appeared in a small series to be much lower. We went to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, in the mid-90s, and we asked for a way to pay for this in Medicare, because there was no way to pay for this in standard fee-for-service Medicare. And what the Medicare program told us at that time was, this is a really interesting model. We think by the year 2000, everyone in Medicare will be in a Medicare Advantage plan that is a capitated total cost of care model in Medicare. That's where you should do bigger, better studies. So we did that, and we put out a request for proposal to manage care. We did a national demonstration and evaluation study, and I'll give you those results in a moment. We started to work on disseminating the model into practice starting in about 2005 or so. We did a CMMI, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation study at Mount Sinai in New York in the 2010s, and I'll tell you about those results in a moment. Over the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen the emergence of several commercial entities in the hospital-at-home space, which some health systems collaborate with to shorten their adoption time of the model. In 2019, with support of the John A. Hartford Foundation in New York, several colleagues and I established the Hospital-at-Home Users Group, which focuses on technical assistance to help hospital-at-homes get started. And then you all know well that COVID hit in 2020, and in late 2020, CMS put out a hospital-level waiver that hospitals could get paid in fee-for-service Medicare to provide hospital-at-home care, and I'll talk about that. So these were the results from our national demonstration and evaluation study, which we published in 2005. And in this study, 61% of patients chose hospital-at-home care. That may not sound like a lot, but imagine now you're an 80-year-old adult, you're in the emergency room, let's say you have pneumonia, the emergency medicine physician has told you that you need to be admitted to the hospital. And then a stranger comes up to you and says, hey, how would you like to get your hospital care? Instead of going upstairs, how would you like to get your hospital care at home? This is being sponsored by your managed care program. And by the way, this is research, and please sign this 10-page single-space consent form. Even in that context, you had an uptake rate of over 60%. And what we also see is that when hospital at home is simply offered as an option for care, you see uptake rates usually above 80%, sometimes above 95%. In the study, care quality was met for each condition at the same or better rates than hospital care. We have lower rates of complications, including a 75% reduction in delirium, incident delirium, which you may know is tied to long-term cognitive effects. We saw lower mortality rates as well. We had better patient and family care experience, lower costs of care by about 20 or 30%, less caregiver stress if you were taken care of at home than the hospital, better functional outcomes in terms of activities of daily living, and good provider satisfaction. We had similar kinds of results when we did a Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation demonstration of hospital at home at Mount Sinai in New York. And in this demonstration, the goal was to not only do the acute hospital at home admission, that usually 2, 3, 4, 5 day portion of the care, but also tied it to a post-acute intervention as well, that is providing very robust transitional care services by the hospital at home team as the patient transitioned back to usual primary care. And in the CMMI demo, we found, again, comparing hospital at home with controls, actually lower acute lengths of stay, which is not uncommon in hospital at home studies, nearly 60% reduction in 30-day all-cause readmission, again, similar 60% reduction in 30-day ED visits, better care experience rating, much lower rate of discharge to skilled nursing facility, and lower overall costs. And then this is a randomized controlled trial of hospital at home performed by my colleague David Levine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is really going all in on hospital at home with an ambition, I think, to develop a 250 bed hospital at home in the Mass General Brigham system. And here you see results of reduced utilization during the acute hospitalization, again, a common finding in hospital at home studies, same safety and quality, more physical activity. No surprise that people are more likely to be moving around a little better and getting out of bed a little bit more when they're in their own home than when they're in the hospital. They had a 38% reduction in total costs, and again, substantial reductions in 30-day readmissions and ED visits. So hospital at home, just to put this in the context of the broader literature, hospital at home has been studied basically since about the late 1970s. Most of the original studies and a lot of ongoing studies have happened in single payer systems, the UK, Italy, Israel, especially Australia and New Zealand. And so there are probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or 80 randomized controlled trials of hospital at home, multiple systematic reviews. This is a systematic review done by a colleague in Australia, Gideon Kaplan. And what he found when he put these studies together was a 21% reduction. This is a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, 21% reduction in mortality. So that's dead or alive at 6 months with a number needed to treat of 50. So for every 50 people you would treat in hospital at home compared to the hospital, one more is alive at 6 months, which is an incredibly powerful effect, and a 24% reduction in readmissions. So what did Walter think? Walter said he definitely would have ended up on a breathing machine if he had been in the hospital. It was great for him to get the attention from the nurses, and he didn't have to worry about his cat. And my fellow was also quite happy because whenever we admitted Walter, I would make my fellow take home his cat. So we've been working a lot on trying to move from research to practice. So this is, if you come to Baltimore and roll down Broadway, you can see the original Hopkins Hospital building. You see the dome in the middle of that picture. That's our corporate symbol, but also where Osler wrote his famous textbook of medicine in the late 19th century. And, you know, when I think of Osler's main contribution, it's really to suggest that, you know, we really don't know all that much, and we really need to look at things, be scientific about things, and move things forward. So that's basically what we've been trying to do. And we've been trying to do a lot of work to broaden awareness and create interest in hospital at home. We've worked on multiple dissemination paths for the model, often payer specific. So we've had some success in the VA, in Medicare managed care, and most recently in fee-for-service Medicare with the waiver, which we'll talk about. We've been doing a lot of work on providing technical assistance to health systems that are interested in hospital at home. I mentioned there have been several new commercial hospital at home entities that have helped spark adoption of the model. And we've been doing a lot of work on payment and policy issues. The real goal here is to mainstream and scale hospital at home. But there are a few barriers to that, and it's worth taking a minute to think about those. So I would say, you know, people often ask me, why don't we see more of hospital at home? How come it's not everywhere yet? And I think payment is part of that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I think fundamentally I think the most important barrier is the issue of leadership and culture change and change management. So why do I have a picture of this unusual bicycle here on the slide? So on the slide, you're seeing a what's called a backward bicycle. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen the video of the backward bicycle. You can go onto YouTube. It's about a 3 or 4 minute video. If you put into the search engine backward bicycle, it will come up. And I'll give you the short version. So you see this bicycle, when you turn the steering bars to the left, the wheel's actually going to the right, which is a little bit odd, a little bit countercultural if you're a bike rider. And the guy who had this bicycle built for himself thought, you know, I'll get this bicycle and I should be able to, you know, do this thing, practice on it, and I'll be able to do this in about an hour or two. It turns out it took him about 6 or 8 months to learn how to ride the backward bicycle. And he uses it as a metaphor for, number one, the challenge in changing hardwired behaviors, and also the difference between understanding that you need to change and actually knowing what to do and affecting change. And that's not unique to healthcare. I think we see this in our personal lives. I think we see this in any business model. But, you know, hospital at home, and I would say home-based medical care models in general, are countercultural in a system, in a healthcare delivery system that is hardwired and built around facilities, right? The culture of healthcare is built around the facility-based care. We have gotten that down quite well. And to change that and to shift focus is difficult. And, one example of it with COVID, hospital systems that had been toying around with telemedicine for a decade or two, it's too hard, we can't do this, how can we do this? They were able to shift and make that change very quickly when there was a payment model and when they had to do it to survive. But I don't know what's happening at Stanford. It could be that you're well ahead of us. But what I see among many health systems, not all, but many, is that as the pandemic has ebbed and flowed, they've gone back to the old hardwired habits. I know for myself, I went from 100% in-person clinic visits to 100% telemedicine, and now we're back at Hopkins to 98, 99% in-person visits again, because that's how the place is wired. That's what it's set up for. That's the culture. So culture change is hard, but it is happening. It is starting to happen. The next, and I apologize, the slide is slightly out of date at this point. I mentioned before that in November of 2020, CMS, after having implemented a number of a bevy of regulatory relaxation early in COVID, in the spring of 2020, by the fall of 2020, you may remember, this is before vaccines were available. Everyone was quite anxious, appropriately so, about hospital capacity. And CMS said, I wonder if hospital at home can help with that as well. And so what they did was they implemented the acute hospital care at home waiver. This is a hospital-based waiver. And hospitals that were interested in applying for the waiver had to apply to CMS, assure CMS that they could provide hospital at home safely and at high quality. And if they got the waiver, CMS would pay a full hospital diagnosis-related group payment for a hospital at home admission that originated either in the emergency room, that is going directly from the emergency room to home, or an admission that started off in the hospital and for a patient who needed continued hospital level care, completed their hospitalization at home. And I think we provided some input to hospital at home as they were developing this waiver. And I think if you had asked us the day before the waiver, how many hospitals would apply for this waiver and get it and do hospital at home, I think we would have said probably about 40 or 50. That would have been our over-under, our prediction for that. Understanding that this payment will exist only as long as the declared public health emergency lasts. Once that PHE is declared over by the administration, the payment evaporates, it goes away. And to date, as of last week, about 227 hospitals had the waiver. There are many more now still in the queue at CMS with waivers, with applications that are pending. So there's been a lot of interest in this waiver, even in the absence of a guarantee of permanence. So as you're getting up to 250, 220, 240 hospitals, you're approaching about 4% of hospitals in the US. If you're interested in diffusion of innovation theory, that puts you on an early adopter slope for hospital at home, which is really, really remarkable to happen in such a short period of time. The other major challenge is what I would call issues related to creating the supply chain and logistics to support hospital at home. So this is a picture. I'm a geographically challenged New Yorker, and if any of you have East Coast roots, you'll know that this is someone who's delivering food to someone in their snug, warm apartment in Manhattan. There's a picture of Times Square during a blizzard several years ago. And use it as a way to think about logistics. Still remember, it's still a facility-based, facility-focused healthcare delivery system, and getting reliable, hardened supply chains to get everything to the home, to do acute care in the home is still not easy. That's going to take a lot of work. A little different than when you're in the hospital and you click a few things in your electronic health record to order an antibiotic or a test, and a lot of processes happen behind that, and things, for the most part, happen. In home-based hospital at home and home-based primary care, those logistics and supply chain still need to be developed in a robust way. But a lot of progress has been made over the last few years. You've seen the entry of major entities like Cardinal Health, which supplies a lot of hospitals, get a sense that Amazon will be getting into this space over time. We've been doing a lot of work on providing technical assistance to interested parties in hospital at home. I mentioned we developed the Hospital at Home Users Group, which provides free technical assistance. We have 81 members. To be a member, you have to have a hospital at home program that's taking care of at least one patient, and then anyone else can join up as affiliates. We have a very active online community with nearly 1,000 participants. We host monthly webinars. We've had co-sponsorship from the American Hospital Association, and it's been very helpful to help move the community forward. We've been working on the development of program standards and specific quality metrics for hospital at home, and also working on payment and policy. And then I mentioned you're starting to see commercial versions of hospital at home that I do think help make the model more scalable, especially for systems that don't necessarily have the expertise or the desire to develop the whole model by themselves. So I think that has been helpful as well. So coming towards the end, and I would just say with leadership and culture change, things can happen. So the picture on the right is a picture of a full page ad in the New York Times that was taken out by Mount Sinai in about 2015 as they were developing their hospital at home and implementing it in the CMMI demonstration study. And the headline says, you know, if our beds are filled, it means we've failed. And you can't read the small print, but it goes on to tell the world everything that Mount Sinai is doing to help keep people out of the hospital. And hospital at home was one of the tools in that toolbox. And I think when I asked my colleagues at Sinai, you know, I think many of them would say back in 2015, this was probably more marketing. But over time, there has been real culture change in that system. And hospital at home is absolutely one of the tools that they have invested in to help keep people out of the hospital. So when they tore down one of their 900-bed hospitals, they did not replace it with another 900-bed hospital. They replaced it with a 200-bed hospital. And hospital at home is one of the reasons they were able to think about doing that. On the right is a headline from a paper that describes the development and scaling of hospital at home in Victoria State, Australia, where Melbourne is. And in the mid-1990s, the health authority there decided to pay for hospital at home at the same rate that they pay for hospital care. And then over time, hospital at home has flourished, such that about 8 or 9% of all hospital bed days in Victoria State are now hospital at home bed days. Their own health authority came out with this paper over 10 years ago to say that had they not done that, they would have had to build another 500-bed hospital. And many of you may know that it costs somewhere between $2 and $5 million to capitalize a hospital bed. I think actually in California, it's where that number goes higher because, you know, you guys have to make all those things earthquake proof. And so, you know, that's somewhere between $1 billion and $2.5 billion in savings if you do not have to invest in fixed bricks and mortar. So there is a societal return on investment to hospital at home. So I think the hospital of the future, and I think what you're going to see in the future, I don't know when that future will be, if it's 10 years or 30 years from now, but I think what you're going to see, hospitals will evolve into big ERs, ORs, and ICUs. And I think everything else, or most everything else, will get pushed out to the community. You saw an inkling of this at the beginning of COVID, especially on the East Coast in New York City and Boston, where, you know, hospitals shut down their elective surgeries. And basically, the whole hospital became an ICU and an ED. So I think those days are coming. And I think as we come down towards the end, just to suggest that hospital at home actually makes a fully baked home-based continuum of care possible. So you see on the large panel is, and I apologize, it's a little bit hard to read, but my colleague Christine Ritchie from Mass General and I did an issue brief for the California Healthcare Foundation to try and educate healthcare leaders about home-based care models. And on the figure here, they're arrayed on the x-axis from models that are more chronic and longitudinal to models that are more acute and episodic, and on the y-axis from models that are non-medical, that have little or no physician or advanced practice provider involvement, to models that have more of that involvement. So towards the origin, you see that paid and unpaid personal care. You have long-term services and supports and home and community-based services, moving through skilled home health care and transitional care. Up on the left, you see a lot of the home-based primary care and palliative care models, and moving up to the right, you see the acute episodic models in the home, such as hospital at home, rehab at home, community paramedicine, mobile integrated health. But the thesis here is that hospital at home, once you can do acute hospital care in the home, it really enables everything under it because the supply chain and logistics get built out. Because the hospital, the bricks and mortar hospital, is not necessarily the default or backstop. You have a backstop in the community. So, final slide. I think that hospital at home will be mainstreamed into U.S. healthcare delivery. I think you're going to see a lot of home-based models really start to take hold. And I think we're going to see a shift from a total focus on facility-based care towards a more even playing field. And just to be clear, hospitals are necessary. No one in this field thinks otherwise. But I think we can really start to change things. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to take my slides down and stop sharing.
All right, well, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Leff, for your presentation. We have a number of questions wanting to start the discussion here. And one of the first ones was in terms of, how do we align the hospital at home initiative with present payer models? Or you mentioned that, you mentioned the backwards bicycle and some of those obstacles already. What are your thoughts about getting that into our U.S. healthcare system?
Yeah, so we've seen hospital at home really grow in the context of the acute hospital care at home waiver. We're hoping there's been a bill introduced in Congress to extend that waiver for at least 2 years, so that CMS could get more data around hospital at home. I would be the first to suggest that the current payment of full DRG, which CMS put out, I think in the interest of trying to keep things simple and uncomplicated and to move something into practice quickly in the setting of the pandemic, was probably the right thing to do, but it's certainly not the most value-based kind of model. So I think it would help CMS to gather more data to get a better experience with that. And there are a number of options to do that within fee-for-service, under total cost of care models, under some of the evolving ACO payment models, whether that's high-need ACOs or others. There's certainly been a tremendous and growing interest among Medicare Advantage plans in hospital at home. And I would say not only in hospital at home, but again, in hospital in terms of home-based models in general. So, and I would say this is particularly important among what I would call payviders, right? So the folks who are both payers and providers of care, whether that's Kaiser, that has been doing a lot in hospital at home and home-based care, or Humana, which is tilting towards home-based models, or CVS. So I think you're going to start to see those payers start to, whose interest is growing, will grow more. And I would say over the last year or two, really have started for the first time to see a growing interest from the commercial payers. So there was some interest from the Uniteds going back several years, but starting to see, the Blues plans get interested in this because they see something happening as well. So I think it's always going to be a little bit of chicken and egg along the way, and it'll be small steps, parallel steps between the provider groups and the payers. But I think that will be emerging.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question or theme in our questions included, one of the things oftentimes we see in the emergency department that families sometimes bring their loved ones when they're just tired of trying to take care, the intense care of a loved one, and they want to try to take care of them at home, but they've just sort of run out of mental and personal resources. How does hospital at home maybe help that, or does that fix that problem, or make it potentially even worse?
Yeah, it's a great question. So how do you think about caregivers in hospital at home and the notion of, caregiver respite, and what can you take care of in hospital at home? So I would say in this context, I would maybe go back to that second or third to last slide I had, where you talk about a home-based care ecosystem, right? So hospital at home is one element of that. But I would say that under our current system, especially for frail older adults, our system does not serve them well, right? It's hard for caregivers to get someone with functional impairment into the clinic. It's very hard, unlike healthcare systems in Europe. We have a relatively completely separate social care and medical care approaches. So the ability to start to integrate those approaches through models that are based in the home could help with that. For the particular instance of a burnt out caregiver who brings a family member to the emergency room, hospital at home may not be the solution to that. But I think a more holistic home-based care system that not only provides different levels of care in the home, but also pays attention to caregiver experience and helps to educate caregivers and help prevent burnout would be helpful there. Good question.
Thank you. That was from Alex Limecooking. And then from some folks who actually have taken medical equipment home and had to take medical equipment home, there's perception that there's a lot of waste there, that someone said that no one's come to pick up the equipment. Is that a common thing? Is hospital at home care really equipment intensive or not equipment intensive? You mentioned that there's a lot of acute care that happens there, and I'm trying to settle, is less is more or more is more in terms of what actually happens within the,
Yeah, I think I would say appropriate is appropriate. So,
okay.
Many of the initial hospital at home studies and a lot of our early work, the equipment that was involved were things like oxygen in the home, things like intravenous medicines and fluids in the home. So there was that. And again, when you have a good supply chain, when those things are no longer needed, you pick up the stuff. So that's absolutely right. More recent iterations of hospital at home have been doing a lot with remote monitoring, which I think is a good development because it helps to keep more of an eye on people in hospital at home. And I think it can serve as an excellent safety feature because, again, if these people were not in hospital at home, they would be in the hospital, right? They have to meet hospital leveling criteria. So, there is some equipment, the hospital at home, whoever is putting up the hospital at home needs to manage that equipment. And part of managing that equipment is to take it out of the home when someone's done with it. So I agree with that completely.
Okay. And, what are the limitations in terms of, or have you found that we assume that patients would have basic utilities or basic appliances or those sort of things? What have you found are surprises that patients might not have that they...
Yeah, so great question. So I mentioned that patient had to meet medical criteria for hospital at home. So they have to meet the threshold for admission, but they can't be so sick that they need an ICU or are going to have an incredibly intense tech-oriented admission, right? You don't want to bring someone home who needs 4 MRIs and 3 endoscopies and a surgery, right? And those kinds of criteria exist, and they've actually worked quite well. Patients also have to have a home that is suitable for hospital at home. And that does not mean living in, a Palo Alto mansion or Park Avenue in New York or on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. It just means that they need, a functional house. You need a roof overhead. You need heat and temperature controls. You need running water. It needs to meet a basic level of hygiene. In our own CMMI demonstration study that I mentioned before at Mount Sinai, 40% of folks lived in public housing in New York. So it's also a model that could help address, I didn't get to talk about this very much, but I think it's also a model that helps to address equity and inclusion. And I think the big part there is that, when you're in someone's home providing care, at least for me, it feels like the whole power equation between clinicians and patients changes. So when I'm attending in the hospital, it's the medical provider's turf. But when I'm in someone's home, I feel like I'm a slightly better doctor, a slightly better person. And I think seeing people in their own setting gives them a little bit of agency and autonomy to express their wishes in a way that's different from the hospital. So you don't. Most homes do meet those criteria.
And what role does we have the advent now of easier or more accessible home patient monitoring or patient monitoring devices, and how has that changed the hospital at home model recently?
Yeah, I think it's changed it to the extent of how the physician input enters the model. So before you had telemedicine, before you had a lot of remote patient monitoring, most hospital at home models, physicians were actually going to the home and making at least a daily visit. With the telemedicine capabilities, many, not all, but many of the models have shifted to have the physician element enter the home via augmented telemedicine. So it might be an advanced practice provider or a nurse in the home with a device at the bedside with the patient and the doctor coming in via televideo. And with the availability of a physician visit, should it be necessary. So you're seeing more of that. And I think with that, you've seen the type of physician change a little bit. So in the early models, it tended to be internal medicine docs and geriatricians who are doing the care in the home usually. Over time, as the hospitalist model also increased in prevalence, and with telemedicine and with the, in most systems, hospitalists are the ones who are managing the admission flow and how all of that works. You're seeing a lot more entry of hospitalists into the hospital at home universe.
Okay, great. What we're seeing in the chat is a lot of support for this notion and a lot of interest in this notion. Some concern about the business model and trying to, I guess, convince hospital executives and otherwise to take a chance on something like this. And for assuming that many of our viewers here today are movers and shakers and innovators within the medical field, what might you suggest are first steps for folks who are interested in trying to push along this model within their healthcare systems?
Yeah, I would say so. I get a lot of inbound calls from leaders in health systems, and they say, heard of hospital at home, I'm really interested in this, I think we want to do it. And the question I will always start with is, tell me the problem you're trying to solve in your system with hospital at home. And I would say, astonishingly, about a third of the time that they can't answer that question, which is always a little bit intriguing to me. About a third of the time, they will describe a problem for which hospital at home could help, but would not necessarily be, at least my first answer to that problem. And I would say probably about a third of the time, hospital at home is a very reasonable thing to consider. So, sometimes if they describe a situation, we have a lot of older people in our hospital, and I will say, do you have a good care transition program? Do you have home-based primary care? Do you have geriatricians? Tell me how you support your internal medicine and family medicine docs to provide complex care. And, if they haven't done those sorts of things, those are things to pursue in solution to that problem before you get to hospital at home. When executives describe issues related to capacity and the desire not to invest billions in capital costs and the idea of developing hospital at home to help anchor more of a community-based approach and home-based approach to care, then I think you're barking up the right tree. But first, I would say to any leaders, make sure you've defined the problem you're trying to solve, and hospital at home may or may not be the right answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So first, find out what your problem is. Ask the question, what is the problem exactly? Go back always to what exactly is the problem. Interesting question coming up from David Sklar. How do we provide hospital at home for those who don't have one? The homeless.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that has come up. And some hospitals at home will actually rent hotel rooms in which to house their patients. So that so the homeless patient who comes into your ED, that is a type of approach that a number of hospitals at home have taken.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what role does emergency medicine and emergency medicine physicians play in the building of managing hospital at home models with the existing healthcare system?
Yeah, so, and I'm sorry I didn't discuss this in more depth. I wanted to give a higher level overview. But what I would say is that emergency medicine physicians, emergency medicine departments, at some level are a keystone in the model, because they could either snuff the baby out in the crib if if referrals aren't made, or if the culture change doesn't happen to recognize that this is an appropriate and safe model, or they could really help the thing take off by making those referrals and helping to advance culture change within a system. So they actually play a very important role in helping a hospital at home get off the ground.
Okay, great. Well, we certainly don't want to snuff the baby out in the crib. Goodness gracious. Okay, excellent. Let's see. What I'm trying to flip through the questions. They're coming in fast and furious. How do you make the business case for hospital at home in a fee-for-service oriented academic healthcare system? Or more, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so assuming the current waiver stays in place for a good bit, then I think you actually have a payment model. Without a direct fee-for-service payment model, it may depend a little bit more on issues related to case mix and payer mix. There are some systems where, if you're thinking about, especially if you're thinking about older adults, common medical service admissions, those tend to be low or negative margin cases for many health systems. So the ability to substitute higher case mix, if you're moving the lower case mix out of the hospital, there is a bit of an arbitrage there. And, that depends on very local circumstances. So there is a model there, but that tends to be very case specific.
And we've had some questions, but I believe you mentioned that there is a ongoing bill or a bill being proposed to extend this CMS waiver for 2 more years. Is that
yes.
what you mentioned before?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent. It sounds like there's a lot of support for that. And to what extent, and you can define your population, are patients excluded because of their social circumstances?
That tends to be a very low number. Yes, low single digits.
Low single digits, and generally due to what cause or what?
Often because of housing that just doesn't meet criteria.
Yeah, housing. Okay. All right. Very good. Let's see. Would independent living units of CCRC be a place to try this model?
Absolutely. Yeah, there is interest among CCRCs for sure. Nursing homes are a little bit more challenging just because of the issues related to Medicaid and all of that, which tends to be a major payer in nursing homes.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So the challenge is not unique to hospital at home, as 8% of global emissions are from healthcare. Oh goodness, there's a climate change kind of thread going on with here somewhere in there too. So sorry, I'm not following the original one. Let's see. And what would you qualify are the main illnesses associated or that get admitted with hospital care? You mentioned starting with.
Yeah, so we when we first started back in the 90s, we started with pneumonia, heart failure, COPD, and cellulitis. Mm-hmm. And what we found over time is, in the CMMI demo we did, we took care of, I think, 60 or 70 different DRGs. You're seeing a lot of interest now in oncology for hospital at home. So the ability to, after, say, someone has a bone marrow, in the context, say, of bone marrow transplant, after the induction, instead of having someone sit in the hospital for a few weeks and wait to get, a hospital-associated infection, do all of that post-induction work at home, right? Because really the main barrier there is blood products and being able to monitor for infection. Why not get out of the petri dish of the hospital? In Spain, they're doing full bone marrow transplants from day one to the end at home. At home. So the ability of hospital at home to take care of more and higher acuity cases is only growing with time, with the development of that supply chain, with the advent of and implementation of remote monitoring and televideo. So, I think you can think about diagnoses, and we do, and I think it's also reasonable to take it from the point of view of, this patient coming into the hospital, what do they need, and can the hospital at home do that? So they need IV medicines. Does it really matter if the antibiotic is for diverticulitis versus pneumonia?
Mhm.
Probably not. Probably not. So you can base it on competencies of what the hospital at home can do, what services it can provide, and you can also think about it in the context of specific diagnoses.
Are there specific diagnoses or ones that you have found that really just aren't amenable to the hospital at home model, or those people end up going back to the brick and mortar facility?
Yeah, I think acute coronary syndrome, those kinds of things where you need an ICU or you're on a step down unit where things are a little bit less predictable in the first few days of admission. Those things are still going to hospital for sure.
Okay. And in the context of thinking about observation units or the 23-hour care sort of model that happens as well in hospitals, how is the hospital at home different, the same? Do they both still have a role within medicine? And where do you put that within the context of hospital at home?
Yeah, so, in the context of the acute hospital care at home waiver, observation stays are not part of that. CMS wanted, I think, to avoid a mission creep kind of effect. In my, the way I would think about it, if someone is coming into the ED and is on for an observation stay, I don't think there's any reason not to. Personally, I don't think there's any reason not to do that at home. And if someone stays in my home-based observational unit more than 2 midnights, convert them to a hospital at home admission. But CMS is not taking that approach just now, and not unreasonably.
Yeah, and I can also imagine a patient who is in observation who may need additional imaging or some sort of procedure or something is not an optimal,
Right.
hospital at home candidate, but they still need to be within the facility.
Right, and if you're in hospital at home and you need an advanced image and you're at home, you can go get the image and come back home.
Oh,
So
I didn't
you're not restricted. Remember, think of the hospital at home unit of the hospital as a virtual unit of the hospital.
I see. Okay, I hadn't thought about that people could still leave and get their tests and then still come back.
Right.
So there's some discussion in the thread also about having Airbnb or that sort of notion other than hotel rooms. So there seems to be.
Also, I think that's in the realm of possibility.
Okay, excellent. All righty. I'm going to turn this over at this point to our hosts, Dr. Imler and Dr. Lowe, for any other additional questions. I think I've exhausted our list here.
Thanks, Andrew. Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leff. We really appreciated it. And I think we've seen a lot of support based on the comments that we have here. And this is very inspiring. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I'm applauding, but you can all also applaud by clicking those little emojis down on the bottom. It's kind of a nice way to give feedback to the speakers. Thank you, Dr. Leff. That was fantastic, and it did make me think of the Airbnb idea. Maybe I'll build out a bunch of Airbnb 80 units and use that for a hospital at home business idea. This actually was a nice segue into the Pitch'em competition. We were talking about hospital at home and some devices that might be used. And just as a little foreshadowing, one of our competitors in our pitch competition happens to be a device at home, hospital at home device manufacturer. So check that out if that interests you. For now, we can slowly segue over to the next panel discussion if you like. It is about AI and machine learning in emergency medicine. I will say, though, we've structured this such that if you would want to, and Dr. Leff is willing, or any of the speakers are willing, you can stay in this room and keep discussing if you like. Anyone who wants to go to the next panel, that will be with our moderators, Dr. David Kim and Christian Rose, and they will have a nice discussion there for you with a great panel of experts. So if you want to leave, that's all fine. You can click on the door at the bottom left. If you would like to stay and ask questions or have a further discussion within this topic, that's fine as well. Enjoy.
The keynote room is still open, right?
It's going well. The keynote.
Oh, good. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, I just got bumped for some reason.